Alright, boils and ghouls. So we have a few franchise or big named horror movies that have released or are releasing soon that we have to talk about. The Exorcist Believer, which is what we'll be talking here. Pet Sematary Bloodlines. Wait for the review on that, but not good at all. And halfway watched VHS 85. Gotta finish the rest of that, but those will be coming soon. But for now, let's talk The Exorcist Believer. Now, I've been trying to think of the best way to approach this. I think you really can't talk this movie without talking about the original Exorcist. What an impact that movie has had on horror, on film in general. And the late, great William Friedkin, so sad that he passed away, which at the end credits to here, I didn't see anything. Maybe it's just my copy, but I didn't even see like an in memory of William Friedkin or anything directed towards William Friedkin. So that's kind of disrespectful in my opinion. But The Exorcist is one of the greatest horror films ever made. And I will always argue this. I have in my Exorcist video, and Exorcist 3, which is just an excellent movie. So just having the original Exorcist and having Exorcist 3, those are pretty much the only high points of this series. So the fact that Blumhouse paid $400 million for the rights to the Exorcist franchise, and then this is what they did with it. Now, I always say and will defend that the demonic makeup and the practical effects on Reagan in The Exorcist, I don't think it's ever been topped to this day. Like, it just, some scenes in The Exorcist just look too fucking real, man. If demonic possession was an actual thing, that's exactly what it would look like. Like everything we see Reagan go through in that first movie. And then just how shocking that movie was for when it came out. Because nobody has ever seen anything like The Exorcist until it came out. That film alone has pretty much created the demonic possession subgenre in horror that we have seen thousands of demonic possession movies. And still, 50 years later, no film has ever come close to nailing it the way that William Friedkin did in the original Exorcist. Like I said, the makeup on Reagan, the scene with her throat bulging out and her eyes being completely white, the shot of her, top-down shot of her with her arms outstretched right before she levitates and her eyes open, completely white, that's one of my favorite shots in a film. So this movie had a lot to live up to. Does it? Let me say this. All the hate this film is getting, and all the hate directed at David Gordon Green, is absolutely not deserved. Absolutely not deserved. This movie is not bad. The first 45 minutes to an hour of this movie is very good. Like, I was invested. I was really caring about these characters. Leslie Odom Jr. just does fantastic here. Like, you really feel for him. You feel for his daughter. The other girl, Catherine, Angela's friend, you really don't care much about her, or at least I didn't, because they pretty much, the focus is on Leslie Odom Jr. and his daughter, Angela. You don't get as much character development with Catherine, so I'm trying to avoid spoilers for the most part for this video, but in the ending, it doesn't hit as hard as it should because you just don't care about this girl as much. But this movie is not a bad movie. This is not a terrible movie. This movie's decent. Like I said, pretty good for the first act and a half or so of this. Now, once they bring Ellen Burstyn into it, that's where it all goes downhill. Let me first say with Ellen Burstyn, she is one of my favorite actresses of all time. Especially her performance in Requiem for a Dream, Darren Aronofsky's film, which I think that's one of the greatest performances by an actress, especially in the last 30, 40 years or so. She does such an amazing job as Sarah Goldfarb in Requiem for a Dream that movie is pretty much, more than The Exorcist, what made me completely fall in love with Ellen Burstyn. Now, she's 90 years old here. I knew from the get-go she wasn't going to have a big part in this movie. In fact, what I theorized upon seeing the trailer for this movie is that she'll be in it very minimally. She might get killed off, which would bring Regan back into the storyline, and that would set up, her getting her ultimate revenge on Pazuzu, which I'm not even sure if it's Pazuzu that possessed these girls. They never really say. I think it's a different demon, because they never mention Pazuzu. But then that would bring Regan back in, and she can have her ultimate showdown with, trying to avenge her mother and what happened to her and everything like that. This isn't much of a spoiler because it's all over the place, but Linda Blair has a cameo at the end of this movie, very, very briefly. But that kind of confirms what I was saying before this movie was even seen by me, that's how they were going to bring her into it. And it seems like she might play a bigger role in Deceiver, which is the next film slated for next year. I don't know. I know that she voiced some concerns in interviews saying that she didn't really want to come back in a big capacity for these Exorcist films. So who knows what they have planned for Deceiver. One thing I can say, and this is why I don't watch trailers. The only reason I watched this trailer was because I had no real expectations for this movie. And I just watched the Saw 10 trailer at the time, which that was an exception to my no trailer rule. I'm a huge Saw fan. I had to watch it. I couldn't contain my excitement anymore. So I had to watch that. Then right after that ended, the trailer for this came on. And that's when I just all right, fuck it. Let me just check this trailer out. I have no hopes or expectations for this movie. Since David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy, I am not a fan of, as some of you know. 2018 is okay. Halloween Kills I do not like. Halloween Ends I thought was atrocious. So I had no hopes or expectations with this film because of David Gordon Green. Of course, it's not all him. It's the other people writing those movies, the studios and everything. So it's not just David Gordon Green, which is why I feel he's getting a lot of unfair hate for this film. I feel like a lot of the hate that's coming into Exorcist Believer is residual hate from Halloween Ends especially, and his Halloween trilogy in general. He does not deserve any hate for this movie. Even though it turns into a train wreck once they introduce Chris McNeil back into the story. But the directing is great in here. There's a few cuts and edits that are very weird in this movie. Like, there's some weird editing in this. But not, like, egregious or anything like that. It's a very well-made film. The cinematography looks very good. These are all things that should be expected from a sequel to The Exorcist in 2023. So, on a technical front, most of it is all good. And I like the whole drama and the tension building with the very beginning 45 minutes of this movie, with the kids going missing. But the big issue here is the trailer. The trailer for this movie ruins a ton of the actual film. This is a movie now that, and this is why I never watch trailers, I wish I didn't see the trailer for this. Because there's stuff late in the movie and stuff that you're seeing in the trailers. So it takes a lot of any shocks or twists and turns, which there aren't much of in this movie, and just takes them completely away because you've seen a lot of these scenes before. The visual imagery and the religious imagery and stuff is well handled also in this movie. But you gotta remember, this is a sequel to The Exorcist. One of the greatest horror films ever made. One of the scariest horror films ever made, if you listen to a whole bunch of people. And when this movie came out in 1973, people weren't ready for it. People never saw anything like this. People were fainting and passing out in theaters and throwing up and questioning their religions and stuff like that. This had a huge impact on people. Now, I think it's a product of its time, just like Psycho. Like, you have younger generations today that look at The Exorcist for the first time and say, okay, so that's it? Like, that's not scary or anything like that. I've always proposed the idea that it was so effective in 1973, and I could be wrong on this, but back then, in America at least, people were a lot more religious. Back in the 70s, compared to nowadays, absolutely. People were a lot more religious. You didn't hear as many people identify as agnostic or atheist or anything like that back in the 70s. There were, don't get me wrong. But we as a country were a lot more religious. And since that whole original film was playing on all these religious themes and stuff, and demonic possession, which a lot of people believing in God and in their religion believe this could happen, and seeing it on screen happening to this 12-year-old girl, Reagan, was just absolutely disturbing at the time. And I feel that's why it kind of stayed a product of its time. Nowadays, religion doesn't seem to be as big as it was back in the 70s. So I feel that's one of the reasons it's always hit harder with older viewers, people that are either around when the film released and saw it firsthand, or, you know, people from the 70s, 80s, 90s and stuff that grew up with this legacy of The Exorcist. So of course this movie was never going to come close to touching the original film. So if anyone had that expectation and then they went into this and hated this movie, that's your own fault. Like, in my opinion, anyone who thought this would come close even to The Exorcist, I don't know what you were thinking. But once Chris MacNeil, Ellen Burstyn, is brought into the movie, that's where it all goes downhill. It turns into just your basic, very generic demonic possession film, pretty much like most other demonic possession films. Like, since The Exorcist. There's a decent amount of practical effects in here, but there's a lot of CGI also, which takes me right out of it as well. The first film, as I said, with just the makeup work alone, and the voice of the demon inside of Reagan. Then you have just the shock scenes in the original film, with the infamous crucifix masturbation scene, and let Jesus fuck you, with a 12-year-old stabbing herself in the vagina with a crucifix, and then taking her mother's face and saying, lick me, and putting her face into her bloody crotch. This is stuff that today you don't see. And as a result, this movie feels very safe. Now, it's not a good or bad thing, in my opinion, that they played it safe with this film. There's a few scenes, like you see Catherine in the church before the whole body in the blood scene that was big in the trailers. You see her masturbating, touching herself, rubbing herself, like in church in front of her brother and sister. But nothing on the level of the original Exorcist. And I feel like that's a film that just can't be made today. The original. And trying to make a legacy sequel to it here, first of all, the whole thing with Chris MacNeil's character, it feels so forced, man. I mean, it's great to see Ellen Burstyn back. It's great to see her still acting at 90 years old. But it seems like she's just there for a paycheck. Like 100%. And I've read interviews with her that she's turned down coming back for Exorcist sequels all these years, and they offered her a lot of money, and it shows. She does not want to be there, in my opinion. It looks like she's there just for the paycheck, and it calls into question like whether Blumhouse and David Gordon Green and stuff said, we want Ellen Burstyn back. That's one of the biggest concerns we have. We want her back as a legacy sequel. Get her. And that's how it feels. And once they introduce her into the story is where it all goes downhill. I mean, you have Ellen Burstyn in your film. Yeah, she's 90, but so what? She's a fucking phenomenal actress. Use her. She is so wasted in this movie. She's literally in this film for maybe 15 minutes. Like, that's being generous. Maybe 10 minutes. She's barely in this film. The parts that she's in the movie, again, you get that feeling that she's not putting her all into it and that she doesn't want to be here. But it's fine, her acting and delivery of her lines and stuff. But literally, she's there for like 10 minutes, and then something happens to her that puts her out of commission for the rest of the movie, basically. You see her in a few small shots throughout the ending. First of all, they completely ruined the character of Chris McNeil. Like, she wanted Reagan to forget everything that happened with the possession. She, even in The Heretic, you see this, like, she wanted to keep this quiet. So the fact that she wrote a book all about her daughter's possession and exorcism doesn't work for me, doesn't work for the character. They completely changed her character just to fit the plot of this movie, and it does not work for me one bit. Overall, I mean, the acting from her is fine. It just doesn't feel organic or anything. Nothing in this film feels like this movie had to be made, that this movie had a story to expand upon from the original Exorcist, and that this story had to be told. Like, this was something great they had here. None of that. Like, there's none of that in here. So overall, I mean, it was a good watch for the first hour. But then it just fizzles out into just very generic demonic possession. Nothing that we haven't seen a million times before. Nothing interesting, nothing new. I mean, yeah, you have 2 girls possessed here instead of 1, but you just have double the possession. They didn't make good use of that. Now, there are very few, but there are 1 or 2 scares in this that are creepy. But for the most part, this is just your typical jump scare galore all over the place. This could have easily been an Insidious movie, a Conjuring film, anything like that. I feel like this movie would be getting much less hate if it wasn't called The Exorcist. If this was just a separate film, take out all the Chris McNeil stuff, and which is forced as hell, as I said, take out the Reagan cameo at the end, and just have this as its own standalone movie, I feel like this would be faring much better, and people would not be hating the shit out of this movie. That's my honest opinion. This has no real ties to The Exorcist. This is not deserving of the title of The Exorcist in any way that I can think of. And I watched this twice. I watched it the first time, and then, like with a lot of new releases, I want to get my thoughts, especially a big name movie like this. I want to get my thoughts completely in place and how I really feel about this. So I needed a rewatch. And it even went up on the rewatch. So I recommend it. I recommend people who haven't seen it, don't just listen to the hate. Don't listen to the hate on this movie. Don't listen to all the hate on David Gordon Green. Just go and check it out with an open mind. The worst that can happen is you'll hate it. I mean, I didn't hate it. I still don't. Best case scenario is you can very much enjoy this movie. So, do I recommend it? Sure. I just don't think it's a good Exorcist film at all. It doesn't go there. It plays it very safe. Now, you can argue that you shouldn't expect it to go all out, since this is the first film in a planned trilogy. So, it makes sense that they would just be setting up characters and story here, that you wouldn't get too much craziness. But bet your ass, man, by the third movie, they better go all the way out and start doing some crazy stuff to make this even worth it. Which, like I said, $400 million for the Exorcist series? I don't know, man. Like, I don't know how these next 2 films are going to fare with the hate that it's getting now. And I just read an article that David Gordon Green might not be returning for the next 2 films. So I don't know if this is because of all the hate he's getting or the hate attached to this movie that's being, thrown at David Gordon Green, and now the studios are starting to say, maybe we got to get somebody else to direct the next 2. I don't know what's going on with him in the next 2 films. I don't feel like the hate this movie's getting lies on the movie itself. I feel like a lot of it is, like I said, just leftover hate for David Gordon Green in general for the Halloween trilogy. Give this one a shot. if you're an Exorcist fan, you might enjoy at least some things in this. And I will say, it did bring up a decent amount of nostalgia, just seeing Chris McNeil back, and then seeing Reagan at the end, Linda Blair. It does have some stuff that will make you say, wow, this is cool to see. But just what they do with it is just not good. So, good first hour, then it becomes a mess. So, that's my initial thoughts on Exorcist Believer. I know Exorcist Deceiver is the next one. I don't know how I feel about that. Hopefully they have a better story and just some more surprises, some more interesting things going on than the same demonic possession stuff we've seen a million times already. But that's Exorcist Believer. Gotta move on to the other films I watched this weekend, and then we have the Five Nights at Freddy's movie that's coming out soon. We have Thanksgiving from Eli Roth coming out in I think it's the second week of November, the 14th, if I recall correctly. We have Hell House LLC, Origins, Carmichael Manor coming out on October 30th. Like, there has been a lot of big name franchises releases in the last month or so, between Saw and then this and then all the aforementioned movies. This is one of the most condensed periods of huge movie releases that I can think of in recent memory. And luckily, for the most part, everything that I've seen, I've pretty much enjoyed. Pet Cemetery Bloodlines, that's the exception. All right, guys. I'll see you guys in a bit. Hope everyone's having a great morning, afternoon, or night. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care, everybody.